I'm joined today by independent journalist Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa Beeley specialises in reporting from the Middle East. She has extensively reported live on the ground from Syria, Egypt, Palestine and Iraq, and has also reported extensively on the conflict in Yemen since 2015. Vanessa has been recognised in the UK and all around the world for her integrity when it comes to journalism. She's been nominated for numerous awards. I'm delighted to have you here today, Vanessa. Thanks for joining us.
No, thank you so much for inviting me on, Finbar. It's really good to be on with you.
I've been watching your work for over 6 years now, and although of late some of the key stories that you've been reporting about have been taken up by some progressive American journalists in particular, I think in terms of how you advocate for the Syrian people is beyond compare and has been not beyond compare, because you've done it in the good times and the bad times. So I'm really thankful to have you here to be able to hear your voice rather than hearing your reporting filtered through other reports, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think, you know, the thing is that a few media outlets have come fairly late to the right side of the war in Syria, let's say. And unfortunately, some of those media outlets are nevertheless still sustaining some of the CIA and MI6 narratives that enabled the war in the first place. And, you know, I don't have any objection to somebody drawing a conclusion, but in my opinion, when challenged by another journalist, they should be able to substantiate that opinion, and they should be able to provide evidence, or they should be prepared to debate the issue. And of course, what we're finding with many of these outlets is that they're not prepared to be challenged, and they're not prepared to be debated outside of the echo chamber that they're actually creating. And in my opinion, you know, this is almost more dangerous than mainstream media, because this is gatekeeping. This is sustaining narratives that are damaging to Syria, to the Syrian people, after 10 years of one of the most protracted and hideous wars. And now, of course, the economic savagery that's being brought to bear upon the Syrian people. Yeah. So I think,
before you go on, Vanessa, because we will go into that, I just want to explain to the viewers, first of all, that we're recording live from Damascus. You have no electricity there at the moment. You're living in Damascus for the last 2 years. So the internet, the visuals of the internet is going in and out with you at the moment. So just to explain to our audience with that. Vanessa, how did you get involved in reporting from the Middle East in the first place?
I'll try to condense it down. I mean, basically, I grew up in a household. My father was one of the most iconic Arabists of his time. He was Middle East advisor post-war to Ernest Bevin. And he and Bevin, of course, were a team that were probably the last of British government diplomats and politicians that were against the Jewish settlement in Palestine at that time. And of course, he and his peers came under attack from Zionist terrorist gangs like the Stern Gang, Ergun, etc. And at that point, that window closed. And of course, we know the history. My father always advocated that allowing the Jewish settlement in Palestine would lead to decades of bloodshed. And he was right. He's been proven right. I grew up, or rather as a kid, I was in Egypt when my father was recalled as peace envoy during the 1967 war by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who trusted only my father among the envoys from Britain. And all his career, he advocated for the Palestinian cause. So I grew up in this environment, if you like, and when he died in 2001, I inherited many of his confidential papers, which led me, I'll reduce it down, it led me in 2012 to enter Gaza, Palestine, by the tunnels, actually, because I was spun, despite having all the visas and the paperwork, I was spun from the Egyptian Rafah crossing. So we entered.
You have a reputation.
Certainly, and I think, you know, my father's name has a reputation, certainly among, he was loathed by the Zionists. So the name does flash up on their security searches. And of course, even on the Egyptian side, it is the Israeli intelligence that checked the entrance into Gaza. So we entered by the tunnels. I think about 2 days after we entered, the Israeli aggression of 2012 started, and basically I stayed there through the bombing raids, which lasted, I think it was 2 weeks in 2012, and then we left again by what was left of the tunnels. And of course I was there with my dear friend and colleague Eva Bartlett, who I actually met at the Rafah crossing in August 2012. And from there, she had already started the Syria Solidarity movement. She invited me to join. And from there, my interest in Syria grew until finally in 2016, I was able to enter as part of a US peace delegation organized by the US Peace Council. I was the only British journalist on the delegation. And then the rest is history. You know, from then on in, I managed to get journalist visas. And I basically entered Syria at some of the most pivotal moments in the history of the conflict against Syria, the liberation of Aleppo, the liberation of Eastern Ghouta, etc.
And that was a liberation from Islamic extremist forces, and we will get into that.
Yeah.
A lot of our viewers would not be familiar with what's happening in Syria other than the standard Western narrative, if you want. I don't even like to use the phrase Western, but that standard NATO narrative might be a better way to put it. In its most basic terms, it could be described as an imperialist war against an independent state. It's a lot more complex than that, and I don't think it could be explained without some of the complexity. Would you be able to give, and I know it's a tough call, but would you be able to give our viewers just a brief overview, but with a little detail about what the hell has happened in Syria since 2012?
Actually, I did just put out a Twitter thread, which maybe you can include in the show links, where I covered pretty much all of the major evidences of imperialist intervention against Syria, starting, of course, in 1956. We have to remember that the current destabilization project in Syria and the attempt to remove the legitimate government and president is only one in dozens of CIA and MI6 orchestrated coup d'etat that started in 1942 and have continued until now. And that's a very important point to make. You know, Syria has been effectively under attack for decades. And even when it achieved its independence from France in 1946, these attacks continued. I mean, in 1956, there was a regime change attempt. They assassinated members of the high-ranking members of the military. And then, of course, Hafez al-Assad took the reins in the country and managed to achieve a huge amount of stability, despite the fact that in the late 70s and early 80s, there was another CIA orchestrated coup d'etat when the Muslim Brotherhood were again instrumentalized against the Syrian government. Of course, this entire narrative is portrayed in the West as the Hafez al-Assad regime massacring the uprising. But what it doesn't mention, of course, is the number of attacks on civilians, the suicide bomb attacks, the massacres.
And this is going back to
army cadets.
Bashir al-Assad's father's day.
Yeah, to Hafez al-Assad. But it's important context because this is very much used, this episode in Syrian history is very much used to show the brutality of the Assad regimes, right? So of Hafez al-Assad and his son, Bashar al-Assad, who of course was trained as an eye doctor in Britain, in London, before he was to some degree forced to take over the presidency because his brother was killed in a car accident. But in the 80s, Hafez al-Assad put down that uprising. And of course, as I said, that's always portrayed as the brutal regime putting down a legitimate uprising. But it's a very similar story to what is happening in Syria from 2011 onwards. And then post 9/11, and just before the invasion of Iraq on the basis of weapons of mass destruction, which we now know, of course, to have been a false narrative to manufacture consent for another intervention in Iraq. We know from the Chilcot report that investigated the scandal of the weapons of mass destruction lie. We know between 2001, 2003, there were emails passing between Bush and Tony Blair describing their intents to take down Iran and Syria. But Blair was basically saying, but we'll try and give Syria, a different approach. We'll try and bring them on our side, in other words. So what we then saw was a campaign of incentivization. I don't know if you know, but in 2002, Tony Blair recommended President Assad for a knighthood in the UK.
And that was around the time that Gaddafi was coming into favor for a short amount of time too.
Yeah, exactly. This is very typical of, for example, you will never hear Saudi Arabia being described as one of the worst human rights violating despotic regimes on the planet. Why? Because it's an ally of the US and the UK. The same with Israel. You will never hear the British government calling out Israel for its human rights violations because it's an ally. So you can tell when the narrative starts to flip, and I challenge anyone before 2009 to find any negative media coverage of Bashar al-Assad. He was being portrayed and perceived as a progressive reformist president, someone that was definitely trying to address the issues of political prisoners, of security apparatus reforms, etc. That was a recognized fact. And there was a book written by actually a family friend of ours, Patrick Steele, on Hafiz al-Assad, which was also very favorable towards effectively the Ba'ath Party's policies, which were very much socialist policies: free healthcare, free education, etc., provision of subsidized food for people that can't afford full pricing, etc., etc. And I've seen this myself living here. Even during the war, the government has maintained this. So then basically we had the flip because Assad did not comply with the NATO member states' demands, namely US and UK, of course, who have the greatest interest in control over Syria and its resources. He basically refused, number one, the Qatari-backed pipeline, which was backed by the United States, in favor of the Iranian pipeline, which of course was being backed by Russia. So that's number one mistake from the US perspective. He also refused to abandon the cause of Palestine's liberation, too. He refused to kick Hezbollah out of Syria. He refused to abandon his long-term alliance with Iran, etc., etc. Plus, he was heavily involved in the 5 Cs project with China, the Belt and Road Initiative, which was originally the Silk Road Initiative, but again, which was a massive threat to US economic supremacy globally, but particularly in the region, right? And so then we started to see the flip of the narrative from 2009 onwards. And in 2009, we know that British authorities contacted Roland Dumas, who was then the French foreign minister, and told him that they were intending to enable and foment an armed uprising in Syria to overthrow the Syrian government. Now, Roland Dumas,
you say that it was the British.
Oh, I've lost sound. Okay,
that it was the United Kingdom.
No, I mean, the United Kingdom contacted France because obviously they are the main controller of what's happening in Syria in the EU, right? And Roland Dumas spoke about this in 2013. But going back, if we're talking about France, in 2012, Laurent Fabius, who was then Foreign Secretary, publicly said Al-Qaeda were doing a good job for them in Syria. And as I said, I've recently done a quite detailed timeline on Twitter demonstrating the intelligence documents, the Clinton emails, the WikiLeaks documents, etc., that demonstrate that this was nothing more than a regime change war that is being, I can hear my voice really loudly.
No, I can hear you okay, Vanessa.
Okay. You know, to overthrow a recalcitrant, independent president of a sovereign nation that, of course, also had no international debt. It had an independent bank, and therefore it was an anathema to the US coalition.
And you mentioned the use of Al-Qaeda. So the French president in 2012 saying Al-Qaeda was doing a good job on their behalf of sorts, or at least in their benefit in Syria. The confusion with regard to the number of groups that are operating, because it's not a case that the United States or the UK directly invaded Syria. That's not the case. They seem to have put in proxies or put in these groups. Could you explain that? Because we're over here, we're told, oh, there are moderate groups and there are extremist groups. And could you break that down? How exactly did they go about destabilizing Syria and trying to oust the Bashar al-Assad government?
Well, initially, of course, they created the death squads inside Syria, just as they had done previously in Nicaragua, for example, the Contras that were under control of the US coalition there. And so again, they instrumentalized the Muslim Brotherhood extremist factions inside Syria, just as they had done in the late 70s and early 80s. And that was called euphemistically the Free Syrian Army, and they were described, again, euphemistically as moderate rebels. But of course, very quickly, the ranks of the moderate rebels were power multiplied by groups like Al-Qaeda that came in from Iraq, from Libya, of course, from Jordan. Weapons were coming in from Jordan. I mean, Ali Hasham, who was an Al Jazeera journalist at the time, actually resigned from Al Jazeera because they refused to air his report of militants and weapons coming in from Jordan and Lebanon into Syria very early on in the conflict, around 2011, 2012. And so very quickly, and of course, then you had the Obama Train and Equip program, or the CIA Timber Sycamore, where $100,000 was basically dedicated to one moderate rebel. And they were spending probably in the region of $1 billion per year until Trump ended the Timber Sycamore program for moderate rebels. But of course, there are now many reports exposing the fact that the weapons supplied to the so-called moderate rebels were mysteriously falling into the hands of groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And
would moderate rebel be a misnomer, or would that be an accurate descriptive term for them? Because I've read places that they're not as moderate as we might be led on to.
No, I mean, look, the Free Syrian Army itself, even before it kind of merged with Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria. I mean, this is done deliberately. This entire sort of rebranding moniker exercise is done deliberately to confuse people and to distract from the fact that effectively, this is a mercenary, extremist, terrorist army that is being funded by the West and its allies in the Gulf states, in Israel, in Turkey, etc., and the EU and UK, to overthrow the Syrian government. This is a professional army. So whatever name you put to it, the ideology is the same, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS, it's sectarian and extremist. The Free Syrian Army, for example, in East Aleppo, I interviewed civilians immediately after liberation, and they told me of the crucifixions, the executions, the sectarian killings carried out by the Free Syrian Army, even before it became merged with or collaborating with Al-Qaeda and a number of other branded groups. But all of these groups in an area occupied by Al-Qaeda are dominated and controlled by Al-Qaeda. So if you call them Ar al-Sham, if you call them Jaish al-Islam, if you call them Shabab al-Sunnah. You know, it's irrelevant largely. They are still carrying out the same atrocities. They are not moderate, they are sectarian, and they are extremist. All of them have carried out ethnic cleansing programs against Syrian ethnic minorities, like Syrian Christians, Syrian Shia, Syrian Druze, etc.
Okay. Just while we're talking about atrocities, we might as well touch upon it now on Douma, Ghouta, and numerous other chemical weapons attacks and alleged chemical weapons attacks at times as well. This use of the word genocide in relation to trying to get support for interventions in states, the use of the label chemical weapons attacks without any evidence whatsoever, it seems to be very commonplace. The people like Samantha Power, who has just been made head of US aid, would be very much interventionist and would be waving those flags. In terms of Douma, I'll let you explain the overall background, but we were led to believe in the so-called Western, again, I don't like using that phrase, but in the West, we were led to believe that Bashir al-Assad's government and troops were using chemical weapons against his own people for some strange reason. But that turned out to be unproven, and you were one of the first people or journalists to be able to bring the news to the West that in fact this was a fake attack and it was a propaganda exercise. Could you give us, and there was an Irishman specifically involved in some of this as well. Could you give us maybe a background to Douma and Ghouta if you want as well?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Samantha Powers, and I don't think I can speak about chemical attacks without speaking about what I consider to be one of the most vile and criminal misrepresentation of fact that was actually done by Samantha Power at the UN. And that was, I don't know if people remember, but in 2015, March 2015, there was an alleged chemical attack, chlorine attack in Sarmin. And Power showed a video of this attack at the UN, and she shed crocodile tears over this video. Now, this video, when I saw it, I was absolutely speechless, because what I was watching was effectively a snuff video. I was watching a so-called doctor plunge a hypodermic needle into the chest of a 2-year-old baby and move it around like this. And this was presented at the UN, and nobody at the UN picked up on the fact that this medical procedure would have killed the child if the child were not already dead, right? And yet this was not even highlighted, of course, the criminalization of the Syrian government. But the Swedish Doctors for Human Rights actually watched the video, and a team of doctors commented on the video, and it effectively demonstrates that these children were very likely used as props to provide the propaganda to suggest a chemical attack and to criminalize the Syrian government, and that was in 2015, just before, of course, the Russian intervention, which was in September 2015. So I wanted to just mention that, because it's often forgotten in the maelstrom of all the chemical attack narratives, but it was for me, one of the most disgusting.
This is a video Samantha Power had no shame in showing to the entire world.
No.
We're doing a feature on Samantha Power in a few weeks' time, so we'll send you that link as well. Just going from Avia back up to Syria.
Yeah, great. And then, of course, we fast forward to Douma 2018. Of course, in between, we had the Khan Shaykhun chemical attack. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details about the fact that it was staged by the White Helmets. We'll talk about them a little bit later, but you have a number of actors, regime change actors and pundits in Ireland who have heavily promoted the White Helmets, and we'll talk about that later. But Khan Shaykhun, I believe, it came immediately after Trump had announced he was going to withdraw US troops from Syria. And the UK media demonstrated the displeasure of the UK government at that time under Theresa May at this move by Trump to leave Syria. So almost immediately we had the Khan Shaykhun chemical attack, which of course ensured that Trump stayed inside Syria. He didn't remove his troops, he didn't withdraw, etc. That's my interpretation of Khan Shaykhun and why it happened. And of course, the
It's
white
all about the
helmets.
timing, isn't it?
Yeah, and the white helmets are predominantly under the control of the British. I mean, they were created by a former British military intelligence operator. Who was working.
Let's go there now, and just for the Irish viewers, Limerick University, amongst a number of places, have given the group that we're about to speak about, the White Helmets, an award. I think they got a Nobel Peace Prize award as well, if I'm not mistaken. Do you want to tell us?
No, they didn't.
Oh,
no,
sorry, they were nominated.
No, they were nominated.
Yeah. Vanessa, do you want to fill us in on who these White Helmets actually are?
Yeah, the White Helmets are effectively a shadow state construct. They were established in 2013 in Turkey and Jordan, not in Syria as they claim. They were established by a former British military intelligence operative, James Le Mesurier, who had previously worked in a number of NATO interventionist arenas like Kosovo. He was based in Pristina. And very importantly, the point to make here, he was based in Pristina after the NATO intervention. He was tasked with the transformation of the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, into the Kosovo Security Corps. Of course, the KLA consisted at that time of Albanian warlords and Al-Qaeda. So effectively, it was a terrorist organization. And under his transformation program, they were carrying out cross-border organ trafficking operations inside Kosovo, right?
So when we're talking about Kosovo, so this is going right back to Yugoslavia in the 90s.
Yeah, 99, he was based there. So then, in a sense, what he was tasked to do in Syria is very similar. He was tasked to create an organization that would give a humanitarian veneer to the narratives and also to the armed groups with whom they were embedded, because the White Helmets are effectively embedded only with the extremist armed groups dominated by Al-Qaeda or Nusra Front or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, as I said. The rebranding exercise is a very clever way to confuse an audience and to make them, not understand who this group is. It's a terrorist group. It's an internationally designated terrorist group that when they carry out terrorist attacks in Europe, by the way, they are called terrorists, but they're not called terrorists for carrying out similar attacks inside Syria. So the White Helmets were created as part of the UK Foreign Office attempt to provide media and PR for the armed groups. And we know from a recent leak of UK Foreign Office documents, the extent of UK Foreign Office involvement in providing NGOs, outreach agencies, citizen journalists, media activities to support the armed groups, that are affiliated to Al-Qaeda and certainly have exactly the same sectarian ideology and who carried out very, atrocities against the Syrian people throughout the last 10 years.
So just to put them into their choreographic place on the stage. So we were speaking about, we spoke about these groups that were being financed and manipulated to destabilize Syria. We spoke about specific faked or orchestrated events to create a pretense that Bashar al-Assad is attacking his own people. And these White Helmets on the stage, they're quite often the guys who are in these videos that are being presented to us as propaganda. So just to put their place on the stage, as it were. So that's where the White Helmets sit. But let's just go back again, if you don't mind, because I don't want to lose the import of these staged chemical weapons attacks and what they were used for ultimately, which was to garnish support for intervention in Syria. Yeah,
and I think, just very quickly, and I think this encapsulates what the White Helmets' role was. There was a 2017 provisional document, UK Foreign Office document, in which they stated that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are almost entirely reliant upon the narratives produced by the White Helmets to corroborate their foreign policy. I'm paraphrasing, but that is effectively what that document said. So that very clearly demonstrates what the White Helmets' role was. It was to provide the propaganda to demonize the Syrian government and allies, so Russia, Hezbollah, Iran, etc., in order to enable military intervention and the ratcheting up of economic sanctions, of course. So if we come back to Duma, in 2018, which came just as Eastern Ghouta was being fully liberated by the Syrian Arab Army from the armed groups, and Douma was pretty much the last area to be liberated. And bearing in mind that the armed group in control of Douma, working and collaborating with the White Helmets, was Jaish al-Islam, the Army of Islam, that in 2013 had burned civilians alive in the bread ovens in the Adra industrial area to the north of Damascus. And those that they hadn't decapitated or tortured or murdered in the streets were brought to Tauba jail in Douma, thousands of them, where they were tortured. I've spoken to survivors of that jail and of the attacks in Adra, because it's the same people. And they were tortured, they were kept in isolation, they were used to test drugs, they were used as props for staged attacks by the Syrian army, etc., right? Women were raped, were tortured, were separated from their children. The list is long. They were caged, put in cages and used as human shields in November 2015. So this is the group that was occupying Douma just before liberation and was working in close collaboration with the White Helmets. And the alleged chemical attack came just as the Syrian Arab Army was negotiating the release of prisoners, so former kidnapped victims from Adra in 2013, and negotiating the surrender of the armed groups and the transport of most of the armed groups to Idlib, which is, you know, part of the Amnesty and Reconciliation Agreement with the Syrian government, which a lot of people also don't know about, is if Syrian members of the armed groups are prepared to put down their arms and surrender, they will be given amnesty. They are not taken to court unless a civilian decides to take them to court for crimes committed against that civilian during occupation. Yeah, so this is a very important point to make. So just as this was happening, the chemical attack occurred, right?
Or the alleged chemical attack.
Yeah. And I was on the ground in Damascus at this time. And just prior to that chemical attack, we had visited the liberated areas close to Douma. So Zamalka and a number of other areas. And we had seen what appeared to be chemical weapon laboratories being run by the armed groups, by the terrorists themselves, right? And then we had this alleged attack. All the people who were on the ground and who went to speak to hospital staff, medical staff, civilians, etc., said it's not a chemical attack. The hospital staff told me there was no chemical attack, nothing. People were coming in with smoke inhalation from a normal attack. And it was the White Helmets who started screaming, chemical attack, chemical attack. And we know the result of that are the stage scenes in the hospital of the kid being hosed down, etc. So
again, innocence being used.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is very much the role of the White Helmets. You know, we so often see, I actually call it child abuse, because the White Helmet videos predominantly are the White Helmets carrying children without families, without father, without mother, without
and clearly
any
in a traumatized state, clearly traumatized children.
Towards the camera, right? Or mishandling them in the ambulance. I mean, they are not paramedics. This is number one. I've had that confirmation from a number of fire brigade members and paramedics in the UK. They're horrified by the procedures being carried out, particularly on children, supposedly being pulled out from under the rubble, etc. And so then fast forward to the fact that I think it was in, I'm losing track of years now. I think it was in 2019, 2020, the actual inspectors who were involved in the OPCW investigations on the ground came forward when the OPCW published its final report that suggested that chlorine had been used, so therefore maintained the chemical weapon narrative attack to, in my opinion, retrospectively justify the criminal unlawful aggression of the UK, France, and US when they bombed Damascus, before the OPCW inspectors had even been able to enter Douma to carry out their inspection, to carry out their investigation. They bombed Damascus. And again, I was in Damascus when the bombing raid happened. And had the Syrian air defenses not intercepted those missiles, civilians would have been killed in their hundreds.
And it was very effective, wasn't it? Because I remember even the so-called progressive liberal left in Ireland, and you know, I was quite annoyed by their lack of insight into the situation, were calling for Assad's downfall because of these attacks, and we're just going along with the narrative. And these are people who would normally be highly critical and would investigate things before they would just take a story for granted. But even they were running with this chemical attack story without any question.
You know, people forget history so quickly. You know, every single intervention, military or otherwise, has been facilitated by false narratives. I mean, they forget the weapons of mass destruction. The chemical weapon narrative is the equivalent to the weapons of mass destruction, just it's longer running, right? And it hasn't yet reached the point of an international investigation like the weapons of mass destruction. And so therefore it still has some kind of tangible meaning to some people. And in Ireland, you've been heavily infiltrated by members of, for example, the Syria campaign. Ronan Tynan has been a vociferous voice for regime change and silencing dissenting or challenging voices like my own. You know, I mean, I've come under attack from Ronan on multiple occasions, and from Syria campaign, who dedicated.
We'll have a look. Our viewers will have a wee look into Ronan and see.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and I mean, Syria campaign ran a 48-page report trying to discredit my reporting from inside Syria and on the White Helmet. Yeah. So effectively now we have a situation where the OPCW is proven largely to be corrupted and compromised.
And the detail of that, just because we just lost that detail there, was that the original inspectors had said basically in their initial report that there was no real evidence of a chemical weapons attack. In fact, there was evidence that it was staged. But as that report went up to the senior levels in the OPCW, it was changed significantly to indicate that there was a chemical weapons attack, and that an Irish scientist, Brendan Whelan, I think his name is, he came out and whistle-blew the situation and stated that, in fact, the report has been doctored significantly by the senior members of the OPCW.
Yeah, and of course, the worrying thing is that the dissenting inspectors, one of which also is Jan Henderson, who's spoken publicly at the UN, are simply not being given a voice. Their concerns are not being allowed to be aired. And we know that when Jose Bustani, the former Director General of the OPCW, who was actually threatened, I think it was by Bolton, over the weapons of mass destruction, because again, he was struggling to find them, let's say. So he was effectively kicked out, right? He tried to speak at the UN. He was invited to speak by the Russian ambassador when they were president of the UN Security Council. And it was vetoed. And this was unprecedented, that other countries would actually veto a former Director General speaking at a UN Security Council panel. Now, of course, what happened was the Russian ambassador read out the statement anyway, so it's archived, it's documented. The record, yeah. But this demonstrates the corruption at the OPCW. The fact is that it's not prepared, or it's too afraid to try and repair its own credibility by airing publicly a discussion with dissenting inspectors, because effectively we have to assume what this will reveal is the level to which the OPCW was pressured to produce a report that would retrospectively justify the UK, French and US narratives, but also their unlawful aggression. And of course, what it does, if this chemical attack can be falsified, all right, what does that mean? Of course, that casts doubt on the previous attacks. And there is now actually an absolutely comprehensive, it's a brilliant report done by a number of independent analysts and researchers on the original 2013 Ghouta attack, which of course weirdly happened just as the UN inspectors touched down in Damascus in August 2013, after an attack in March 2013 that was carried out by the terrorist groups against
Assad's forces.
Yeah, exactly.
So all the indicators, even the most basic indicators, were that these so-called revolutionary groups, that all the indicators are that they are the ones in possession. And in fact, Syria went through an international process of rid of its own stockpiles that its father would have had.
Yeah, and in fact, when France, UK, and US bombed Damascus post Duma, they bombed what they said in Berzeh, quite close to where I am now. They bombed what they claimed to be a chemical weapons factory. Now, when the OPCW inspectors went in, they said, no, it's like a factory producing, I think it was anti-venom for a snake bite. So, you know, this entire narrative is so criminally misrepresented and falsified in order to, as we've said, to enable military intervention, to sustain the economic barbarism.
But more specifically, it's to get into the head of the viewers, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's to convince both the viewers of 2 points. The first point is that Assad and Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian government are evil in some way. But the second point that I think it's making, it's trying to convince the so-called West that the Syrian people want to oust their president at all costs. Now, I know that there have been recent elections. You are one of the only journalists I've come across that unapologetically contradicts the narrative that the Syrian people want to oust Assad at all costs. Do you want to address that?
Sure, and thank you for giving me that opportunity. Of course, you know, I'm always described as either as an Assad apologist, but actually, where am I coming from? I'm coming from the fact that I uphold the sovereignty and self-determination of the Syrian people. And the Syrian people have time and time again chosen Bashar al-Assad to be their president. They did in 2014. In Lebanon, for example, Syrians in diaspora, they had to keep the embassy open for an extra day to allow the huge number of Syrians to go and vote for President Assad. That was in 2014. In 2021, leading up to the elections, I actually went to some of the areas that had previously been under control of the armed groups before liberation, and saw the civilians there freed from that occupation, celebrating the upcoming elections and showing their support for Bashar al-Assad. Now, on the day of election and when elections were announced, literally millions of Syrians came onto the streets to celebrate. And that is despite the misery of sanctions, the poverty that sanctions has brought to the people here, a country that pre-2011 was one of the most secure and stable in the Middle East, and nobody had a complaint pre-2011. Everyone will tell you this was the most peaceful, stable, secure country. People could go out at 2 a.m. without any problem at all. They could get in a car with a stranger, no problem at all, etc. Right? And millions of Syrians came out on the streets in May this year. And in my opinion, this was not only because of the re-election of President Assad. This was a message to the West to basically say, your opinion of our country is irrelevant. Your vision for our country is irrelevant. Whatever you do to us, we will resist and we will take back our country. We will sustain our secular way of life. We don't want a backward Islamist regime in control in our country that is going to drive the Christians out of our country, massacre the ethnic minorities that don't comply, and turn this country into a failed Salafist state.
Another Libya.
Yeah, exactly. You know, with marauding mafia gangs, because that's very much how I perceive the terrorist groups to be. They're mafia organizations. You know, they compete with each other for they compete for territory, for money, for equipment, for weapons, etc. But ultimately, the ideology is actually the same, and that's why they can intermingle. That's why they can swap from one group to another, and they can have gang fighting as they are now having in Idlib, because Hayat Tahrir al-Sham are calling the shots and saying, if you don't join us, you can get lost, basically. Right,
Yeah.
and this is mafia operations to me, mercenary mafia
There is
operations.
how I have perceived it, to be honest with you, again, coming from Ireland, where we were heavily invaded for a few hundred years by Vikings. They're looters. They are looters. Come to loot and to steal.
Yeah. And that's exactly actually what they do. I mean, I was recently on the borders with the Idlib front lines, and there, one of the biggest power plants, Zaytun power plant, has been completely dismantled by various Turkish-backed terrorist groups in the Idlib area. And all the metal, all the equipment has been stolen and taken and traded in Turkey, all melted down and traded in Turkey. And this is a common practice. All areas under occupation of these armed groups are completely destroyed. Everything is destroyed. Everything that is essential to civilian livelihood has been destroyed, including hospitals, which are occupied by these armed groups, by the way, and turned into Sharia courts and detention and torture centers. And again, I've seen this myself personally. I visited these former hospitals in East Aleppo, in Eastern Ghouta, in all areas of Syria, in southern Idlib, in northern Hama, etc., that were taken over by the terrorists and used effectively as military centers, ammunition dumps, ammunition factories, Sharia courts, torture and detention centers, etc. Right? So, you know, when you hear the narrative, oh, well, Russia has again bombed a school or a hospital, those were the buildings that most of the time are taken over and converted into military centers because they're perfect, right? They're big, they have a huge number of rooms. And of course, when they are targeted, the cry can go up, oh, they're targeting hospitals, they're targeting civilians.
Yeah. We're coming close to the end, Vanessa, of our time. I've got two final questions for you.
Yeah.
First of all, there's been a decade of direct and indirect military interventions in Syria. There has just been chaos and turmoil thrown at the country from every angle, from Western sources mainly. They haven't won, have they? For all their effort, they have not defeated the Syrian state.
No, and I think what I said about the May elections proves that. The problem is that now, my opinion is now it becomes like a vindictive campaign. It's no longer that they know they've lost. They know that effectively Russia now is the main player in the region. You know, it's expanding its military base in Tartus on the coastal areas of Syria. And it's opened the doors to Iranian expansion, to China's expansion, which is why, of course, they've brought in the Caesar sanctions to basically sanction anyone that comes to the aid of Syria for the rebuilding, the restoration, etc. Right? So this is their attempt. That's what I'm saying. It's now a vindictive campaign. So now the US is occupying the oil fields. Its proxies are trading the oil again inside Turkey. By its proxies, I mean the Kurdish separatist factions. So it's occupying the main resource area of Syria, because the northeast is, of course, the breadbasket of Syria also. So, for example, wheat and barley is being stolen by the SDF and traded outside Syria, and they're not selling it to Damascus for supply, for use in, for example, providing bread for civilians in Syria under the protection of the Syrian government. So this is, all of this is a deliberate attempt to blockade, besiege, deprive the Syrian people, destroy civilian infrastructure, deprive them of electricity, fuel.
Bring them back to the Stone Age.
Yeah, basically. And you know, we've seen this before. We've seen it in, as you said, in Libya, in Yemen. We're seeing a very familiar pattern of what's happening in Yemen: total blockade, total collective punishment of 23
We saw it in Iraq, we're seeing it in an increase in Venezuela, Bolivia, Cuba. I think Peru is about to get a wallop.
Yeah, and the fact is that, you know, the UK beef with Syria is its connections to previously the Soviet Union and now with Russia, right? This is a complete anathema to the UK in particular. The last thing it wants is, in its view, it still thinks of Soviet Union days. It doesn't want Russian influence in the Middle East. And of course, the whole US coalition is interested in the security and protection of Israel above all else, of course, in the region, because Israel gives them dominance in the region and ensures their supremacy in the region. So now we have what I call a vindictive campaign. Now it is the punishment of the Syrian people. They know that nothing they do is going to cause the Syrian people to rise up against their government.
But they're never ever going to be able to come with a
the fact
now,
is that
they're
no,
never
and I don't think they, but I don't think they have any intention of doing so. They have now the intention of probably, I think now you're going to see the chaos strategy spreading into the rest of the region. We've seen it happening in Lebanon, of course, in the last 2 years. The absolute, I mean, the destruction of the economy has been going on for a long time, but it came to a head in the last 2 years. Then we had the Beirut port explosion, which has decimated the whole of Lebanon. You have, again, UK Foreign Office infiltration of security, intelligence, army, governmental institutions in Lebanon, exposed by another recent UK Foreign Office document leak. So you know that now the work is to destabilize the entire region. We're seeing ISIS attacks on electrical installations in Iraq, again, to deprive them of electricity during 48 degrees heat, etc. So now I think this is what we're going to see. We're going to see intermittent terrorist attacks in Syria. We're going to see the continuation of the situation in the south in Dara, of the terrorist groups refusing basically to surrender in the center of Dara city. We're going to see the US occupation military base in Al Tanaf on the border with Jordan, and their control of the Rukban refugee camp being used as a recruitment and training center for ISIS and other armed groups to carry out isolated attacks in the Syrian desert towards Homs and Palmyra. The continued occupation of the northeast, the Turkish annexation of Syrian territory, remembering, of course, that Turkey is a NATO member state and is collaborating with the US despite all of the kind of theatrics, right? So I think this is what we're now going to see. We're going to see a sort of forced isolation of Syria in a blockaded, besieged central region, occupied by Israel in the south, by America in the entire eastern bloc, by Turkey in the northwest, you know, and Lebanon in economic freefall and unable to come to their aid or to offer any assistance whatsoever.
My goodness, I don't know. I was feeling hopeful about Syria until yeah, you told me that. But please God or the gods or whoever it might be, that some sense will come to this situation, that Russia and China and Iran would be able to come to a deeper and more controlling plan in terms of being able to protect Syria as a brother state, I suppose. Vanessa, if people want to follow your work, if they want to see what's really happening where you are at, and maybe even to get more involved with any campaigning and things like that, how would they follow you?
They can follow me on Patreon, Vanessa Beeley on Patreon, Subscribe Star. I have obviously a YouTube channel. I also have an Odyssey channel because YouTube recently pulled all my videos. They've reinstated them now. But obviously YouTube is a big part of the overall censorship campaign of any dissenting voices on almost any subject right now. And then I'm writing obviously for Unlimited Hangout, for The Last American Vagabond, RT, etc., etc. But my Patreon and my blog, which is The Wall Will Fall, are the main areas where I publish everything basically.
Vanessa Beeley on Patreon, the blog The Wall Will Fall, and Vanessa Beeley on YouTube would probably be a starting point anyway.
Yeah.
Vanessa, I really want to thank you. I know that you're in sweltering heat and you guys have no electricity over there. I'm mentally sending you an ice bath of some sort.
Thank you.
To cool you down. I'm really, really, really grateful that you came on today. keep up the good work, be safe, and I hope that we'll be speaking to you again soon.
I hope so. Thank you so much, Finbar.
Thank you, Vanessa. Bye-bye.